Silk whispered. Engine clicked before the gunshot. In the back of a Grafe, stiff double phaeton, Archduke Franz Ferdinand adjusted his heavy, pale blue general's tunic. On his chest sat a constellation of medals, each one representing a century of Habsburg tradition. Sophie, radiant, wore white silk. Anniversary. Court's frozen facade hid their love's fire. But today, in the distant city of Sarajevo, the rules were different. Ferdinand looked at his wife and saw not just a duchess, but the woman he had sacrificed his political peace for. Crimson stained her white silk dress within an hour. They lived in the Belle Époque, a beautiful era. Paris, Berlin, a world felt invincible. Globalism won. It was an age where a London banker could invest in a Siberian railroad via a telegram that arrived in minutes. The world was stitched together by a massive web of iron rails and underwater cables. In many ways, the world was more economically integrated in 1914 than it would be again until the 1990 seconds. Why did a world so obsessed with profit and progress suddenly decide to commit collective suicide? The answer lay in the Gilded Cage of the European alliance system. Imagine the continent as a dark room filled with invisible, high-tension tripwires. On one side stood the Triple Entente: Britain, France, and Russia. On the other, the Triple Alliance: Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. These weren't mere friendships. They were rigid, legalistic contracts. If Country A moved a single battalion, Country B was legally obligated to mobilize millions. It was a system designed to prevent war through mutual assured destruction, but it relied on a fatal assumption that every leader would act rationally. It didn't account for a driver who couldn't speak the language or a teenager with nothing to lose. Franz Ferdinand himself was the greatest paradox of this age. He was a man of cold, brooding temper, yet he was capable of a love so fierce it nearly toppled an empire. When he fell in love with Sophie in 1894, he broke the ultimate law of the Habsburgs, the oldest royal bloodline in Europe. To the emperor, Sophie was a commoner. Their union was labeled a morganatic marriage. This meant Sophie would never be empress, and their children would never wear the crown. In Vienna, Sophie was treated as a ghost. At royal banquets, she was forced to sit at the far end of the table, far away from her husband. Sarajevo was Ferdinand's way of fighting back. As Inspector General of the Armed Forces, he could bring Sophie to Bosnia and ensure she received the royal honors denied to her in Austria. He thought he was taking her to a place of dignity. He didn't realize he was leading her into a kill zone. Ferdinand wasn't hated because he was a tyrant. In fact, he was the one man who could have saved the empire. He championed a plan called trialism. He wanted to turn the dual monarchy into a triple monarchy, giving the Slavic people, the Serbs, Croats, and Bosnians, an equal seat at the table. To a rational observer, this was a brilliant reform. But to a radical Serbian nationalist, it was a death sentence for their cause. If Ferdinand succeeded in making the Slavs happy within the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the dream of a greater Serbia would die forever. The Archduke had to be eliminated precisely because he was a reformer. He was a threat to the revolution because he offered a peaceful alternative to blood. As their train puffed toward the Bosnian border, Ferdinand ignored the warnings. June 28th was Vidovdan, a sacred day of Serbian mourning and pride. To parade an imperial heir through the streets on that day was a stinging insult to every nationalist. But Ferdinand only saw the sun reflecting off the river and the smile on his wife's face. He turned to his aide and remarked on how beautiful the weather was. He couldn't see the 7 young men moving through the shadows of the Sarajevo quay, their pockets heavy with bombs and their lungs burning with disease. In a dimly lit, smoke-filled cafe in Belgrade, called the Zlatna Maruna, A 19-year-old student named Gavrilo Princip stared into the bottom of a coffee cup. His skin was the color of parchment, and his chest rattled with a wet, heavy cough. In 1914, tuberculosis was the White Plague of the Balkans, a slow-motion execution that primarily targeted the young and the poor. Princip was already a dead man walking. He knew he would never see his 30th birthday, and that realization gave him something more dangerous than expertise. It gave him the courage of the hopeless. This is the anatomy of a radical. Princip wasn't born a killer. He was a peasant boy who had seen 6 of his siblings die in infancy. He was brilliant, a reader of poetry and anarchist manifestos, but he was also deeply insecure. When he tried to join the Serbian army to fight in the Balkan Wars, the recruiters laughed at him. They told him he was too small and too weak to carry a rifle. That rejection curdled into an obsession. He didn't just want to free his people. He wanted to prove that he was a giant of history. How did a group of broke, sick teenagers manage to get their hands on military-grade weapons and infiltrate a superpower? The answer lies in the deep state of 1914 Serbia. While the official Serbian government was trying to avoid a war it couldn't afford, a shadow organization was pulling the strings from the darkness. This was the Black Hand, a secret society of military officers led by a man known only as Apis the Bee. Apis was a master of the shadow world. In 1903, he had led a bloody coup, murdering the previous king and queen of Serbia and throwing their bodies out of a palace window. He answered to no one. Apis chose Princip and his friends because they were clean. They weren't professional soldiers, they were students. If they failed, they were just crazy kids. If they succeeded, Serbia got its revolution, and the government could claim plausible deniability. Apis provided them with 6 grenades and 4 Browning FNM 1910 pistols, but he also gave them something more sinister, a small glass vial of cyanide for each boy. His instructions were clear. Once the deed is done, drink this. Do not be taken alive. Apis wasn't trying to protect the boys. He was trying to silence them. The technology of terror, the weapons they carried were a strange mix of cutting edge and archaic. The Brownings were masterpieces of engineering, reliable, semi-automatic, and easy to conceal. But the grenades, the Kruka models, were a nightmare to use. To activate one, the assassin had to unscrew a safety cap, strike a detonator pin against a hard surface like a street lamp or a stone wall, and then wait. The fuse on these grenades was designed to last exactly 13 seconds. 13 seconds. In the context of a high-speed chase or a crowded street, 13 seconds is an eternity. If you throw too early, the car drives away. If you throw too late, it explodes in your hand. This mechanical flaw would nearly ruin the entire plot and turn the assassination into a dark comedy of errors. Princip and his comrades began their journey to Sarajevo, smuggling the weapons across the Drina River. They traveled by night, guided by Black Hand agents who operated a secret tunnel of safe houses. Princip was so ill he could barely carry his pack, but the fire of ideology kept him moving. They hid the bombs in their waistbands, covered by their cheap student coats, and slipped into the city like ghosts. By the night of June 27th, the 7 assassins were spread out along the Appel Quay, the main road the Archduke would travel. They were amateurs. They were shaking with fever. They were terrified. But as the sun rose on June 28th, they were in position. The deep state had done its job. The stage was set for a collision between an empire that was too confident and a group of teenagers who had nothing left to lose. The sun was climbing high over Sarajevo by 10 a.m., baking the cobblestones of the Appel Quay. The air was a heavy, stagnant mixture of horse manure, wood smoke from the surrounding hills, and the metallic, muddy scent of the Miljacka River. This river, usually a symbol of the city's life, was at its lowest summer ebb, a shallow, sluggish stream barely concealing the rocks in its bed. Along the quay, thousands of people stood shoulder to shoulder. Some were there to cheer for their future emperor. Others stood in a cold, resentful silence. Tucked among them, spaced out at strategic intervals like human landmines, were the 7 assassins. They were dressed in cheap, dark student suits that felt like wool ovens in the June heat. The royal motorcade began its slow crawl toward the town hall. There were 6 cars in total. The Archduke was in the second car, a magnificent greffe and stiff double phaeton with the top folded back. To the crowds, it looked like a parade of invincibility. But inside the cars, the atmosphere was thick with a different kind of tension. Franz Ferdinand was hyper-aware of his vulnerability, yet he refused to let it show. He sat tall, his plumed hat catching the light, while Sophie sat beside him, smiling at the children waving flags. But here is the microscopic detail that history books often gloss over. The first 2 assassins didn't fail because of the Archduke's security. They failed because of a human glitch. The first assassin on the route was Mohammed Mehmed Bashic. As the car approached, he reached for his grenade. He felt the weight of the metal, the rough texture of the safety cap. But as his eyes met the gaze of a nearby policeman, his body simply refused to move. He was paralyzed by a sudden, overwhelming realization of the scale of the act. He watched the car glide past, his hands empty. The second assassin, positioned just yards away, suffered a similar collapse of will. In the quiet of a Belgrade cafe, killing a prince felt like poetry. On the sunlit streets of Sarajevo, surrounded by the heat of human bodies and the smell of exhaust, it felt like madness. The motorcade reached the third man, Nedeljko Chabranovic. Unlike the others, Chabranovic was fueled by a desperate, theatrical need for recognition. He didn't just want to kill the Archduke. He wanted the world to watch him do it. When he saw the greffe and stiff approaching, he didn't hesitate. He pulled the grenade from his pocket, unscrewed the cap, and struck the detonator pin against a nearby lamppost with a sharp, metallic crack. But here is where the 13-second physics we discussed earlier turned the tide of history. The chemical fuse began to hiss, invisible but deadly. Chabranovic took aim and hurled the bomb. But a moving car is a difficult target for a nervous amateur. The grenade didn't fly into the Archduke's lap. Instead, it struck the folded-back canvas of the convertible top. Franz Ferdinand, showing the reflexes of a man who had spent his life hunting, saw the black object flying toward Sophie's head. He instinctively swatted it away with his arm. The grenade bounced off the car, tumbled into the street, and rolled directly under the wheels of the third car in the motorcade. 13, 12, 11. The Archduke's driver, Leopold Lojka, stepped on the gas. The second car roared away just as the 13 seconds expired. The explosion was deafening. It tore through the front of the third car, shredding its tires and peppering the occupants with shrapnel. Count Bus Waldeck and Colonel Maritzi were suddenly covered in blood, their uniforms torn to rags. 20 spectators on the sidewalk were struck by flying glass and metal. The air was suddenly thick with a pungent cloud of white smoke and the smell of ozone. But what happened next moved the event from the realm of tragedy into the theater of the absurd. Nedeljko Chabranovic, convinced he had succeeded and determined to die a martyr, pulled out his vial of cyanide. He swallowed the liquid and, with a dramatic flourish, leaped over the stone railing of the bridge into the Miljacka River. This was supposed to be his final, heroic act. Instead, it became a farce. The cyanide was so old and degraded that it had lost its lethal potency. Instead of killing him, it merely acted as a violent emetic, causing him to retch and vomit uncontrollably. And the river? Because of the summer drought, the water was only 4 inches deep. Instead of a noble death in a rushing torrent, Chabranovic landed face first in the mud and garbage of a nearly dry creek bed. He lay there, retching and gasping, as angry onlookers and police officers scrambled down the banks to haul him out. He was dragged through the mud, beaten by the crowd, and taken into custody, still alive and very much a failure. The motorcade, now reduced to 5 cars, sped toward the town hall. Franz Ferdinand was shaking with a cold, focused rage. Sophie was terrified but silent. The remaining assassins, including Gavrilo Princip, heard the explosion from their positions further down the quay. They saw the cars race past at high speed and saw the smoke rising from the bridge. To them, the mission appeared over. They assumed the bomb had done its work. Princip, feeling a strange mix of relief and hollow defeat, began to wander away from his post. He walked toward a small deli on a street corner, looking for a place to gather his thoughts, believing that the Archduke was either dead or long gone. He didn't realize that the comedy of errors was only in its first act. He didn't know that the Archduke's own sense of duty was about to lead him directly back into the line of fire. The Sarajevo town hall was a building of stiff, neo-Moorish beauty, but inside its cool stone walls, the atmosphere was white-hot with tension. Archduke Franz Ferdinand stood in the grand hall, his pale blue uniform now dusted with debris and splattered with the blood of his subordinates. As the mayor of Sarajevo began to read a pre-written welcome speech about the city's heart beating with joy, Ferdinand's famous temper finally snapped. "What is the good of your speeches?" he thundered, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "I come to Sarajevo on a visit, and I am greeted with bombs. It is outrageous." Sophie leaned in close, her hand on his arm, whispering words that only he could hear. Her calm was the only thing preventing a full diplomatic meltdown. After a few tense moments, Ferdinand regained his composure and allowed the ceremony to finish. But as the party prepared to leave, a heated debate broke out among the officials. The governor of Bosnia, Oskar Podgoric, was humiliated. His security arrangements had failed. He insisted that the Archduke should leave the city immediately. However, Ferdinand made a decision that was both noble and fatal. He insisted on going to the hospital to visit the officers wounded by the morning's blast. But here is the microscopic detail of the communication breakdown. The chain of command was shattered by panic. The officials decided to change the route. Instead of driving through the narrow, crowded streets of the city center, the motorcade would speed back down the wide Époque quay. It was a sound plan, but in the frantic rush to leave the town hall, no one bothered to translate this new plan to the drivers. The lead driver and the Archduke's driver, Leopold Lojka, only spoke Czech and German. They were never told that the route had been altered. The motorcade set off again at 10:45 a.m. Lojka, following the lead car, reached the corner of the Latin Bridge and did exactly what the original morning plan dictated. He turned right, off the quay, and onto Franz Joseph Street. General Podgoric, sitting in the front seat of the Archduke's car, suddenly realized the mistake. "What is this?" he shouted at Lojka. "This is the wrong way. We are supposed to go straight down the quay." Lojka, startled by the general's shouting, slammed on the brakes. The heavy Greifenstift lurched to a halt. Why couldn't the driver just speed away? Why did the car become a sitting duck? In 1914, the automotive industry was still in its infancy. The Greifenstift was a masterpiece of luxury, but it lacked a synchronized reverse gear. To move backward, the car had to be brought to a complete dead stop. The heavy gears manually disengaged, and the reverse gear painstakingly slotted into place. As Lojka struggled with the gear lever, the engine hissed and sputtered, nearly stalling. For a few agonizing seconds, the most powerful man in the empire was motionless, caught in a mechanical trap. And standing on that very corner, less than 5 feet away, was Gavrilo Princip. Princip had been standing outside Schiller's deli, nursing his sense of failure. He had heard the bomb go off earlier and assumed the chance was gone. Then, like a dark miracle of fate, the very car he was hunting stopped directly in front of him. He didn't have to chase it. He didn't even have to aim. Princip reached into his coat and pulled out the FNM 1910 pistol. He stepped toward the car, his face a mask of cold determination. A bystander tried to grab his arm, but Princip was faster. He turned his head away, almost as if he couldn't bear to look, and fired twice. The physics of the shots were as precise as they were devastating. The first bullet struck the Archduke in the neck, severing his jugular vein and lodging in his spine. The second bullet was intended for Potiorek, but as Sophie threw herself across her husband to protect him, the round struck her in the abdomen. For a heartbeat, there was a haunting, vacuum-like silence. The driver, Lojka, seeing the royal couple still sitting upright, initially thought they were unharmed. He finally managed to get the car into gear and accelerated away. But as the wind hit them, a thin, bright stream of blood began to spray from Ferdinand's mouth. Sophie, sensing the end, cried out, "Franz, Franz, don't die. Stay alive for our children." Then, she slumped onto his knees. Ferdinand, despite the massive trauma to his throat, reached for her. He whispered, "Es ist nix. Es ist nix. It is nothing. It is nothing." He repeated the phrase 6 or 7 times, his voice growing fainter with each breath. By the time the car reached the governor's residence, the white silk of Sophie's dress was soaked through, and the Archduke was unconscious. By 11:30 a.m., the heirs to the Habsburg throne were dead. Princip tried to turn the gun on himself, but the crowd swarmed him. He was tackled, beaten with the flat of sabers, and nearly lynched before the police dragged him away. As he was led to a cell, the bells of Sarajevo began to toll. They were not just ringing for a prince and his wife. They were ringing for the end of a century. The Gilded Cage had been broken, and the invisible tripwires of the alliance system were now vibrating with the force of a global earthquake. The world did not end on the 28th of June 1914. Instead, it entered a period of haunting, deceptive stillness. As the news of the assassination pulsed across the telegraph wires of Europe, the initial reaction was not a cry for war, but a collective gasp of shock followed by a strange, indifferent silence. In London, the newspapers were more concerned with the looming civil unrest in Ireland. In Paris, the public was captivated by a sensational murder trial involving the wife of a former prime minister. Even in Vienna, the first few days were marked by a somber but orderly mourning. Most Europeans, living in the peak of the Belle Époque, assumed this was just another Balkan mess that the diplomats would eventually sweep under the rug. They did not realize that the fuse lit in Sarajevo was still burning, hidden beneath the floorboards of the great palaces. Inside the Hofburg Palace in Vienna, the atmosphere was frozen. Emperor Franz Joseph, now 83 years old, received the news of his nephew's death with a cold, almost eerie detachment. He did not weep for Franz Ferdinand. Their relationship had been fractured for years by the Archduke's marriage to Sophie. To the emperor, the tragedy was not personal, but institutional. The honor of the Habsburg monarchy, a dynasty that had ruled for 600 years, had been spat upon by a peasant kingdom, Serbia. But here is the microscopic detail of the imperial funeral that signaled the coming storm. Even in death, the court refused to give Sophie dignity. The funeral was a third-class affair. To maintain the rigid protocols of the court, Sophie's coffin was placed on a lower level than the Archduke's. Her fan and gloves, the symbols of a lady-in-waiting, were placed on her casket to remind the world that she was not of royal blood. This final insult to the dead couple only deepened the resolve of the war party in Vienna, led by General Konrad von Hötzendorf. He believed that if Austria-Hungary did not crush Serbia now, the empire would be seen as a living fossil, a dying giant that any minor power could poke with a stick. But here is the mini-hook. Why did Austria wait nearly a month to act? Why didn't they strike while the world's sympathy was still with them? The answer lies in the harvest and the blank check. Austria-Hungary was a patchwork empire of farmers. If they mobilized their army in early July, they would ruin the harvest and starve their own people. More importantly, they were terrified of Russia. Serbia was Russia's little Slavic brother. If Austria attacked Serbia, the Russian steamroller would crush Vienna. To act, they needed a guarantee from the most powerful military force in the world, Germany. On the 5th of July 1914, an Austrian envoy met with Kaiser Wilhelm II at the Potsdam Palace. The Kaiser, a man of erratic impulses and a deep obsession with personal honor, was horrified by the murder of a fellow royal. He didn't consult his advisors or his parliament. He gave the Austrians the infamous blank check. He told them that Germany would support Austria-Hungary whatever they decided to do, even if it meant war with Russia. Wilhelm believed that a show of absolute, ironclad unity would scare the Tsar into staying neutral. It was the most expensive bluff in history, a high-stakes game of poker where the chips were the lives of an entire generation. The microscopic detail of the diplomatic, slow-motion train wreck now began. Vienna spent the next 3 weeks meticulously crafting a document designed to be rejected. This was the ultimatum. It wasn't a request for justice. It was a demand for the total surrender of Serbian sovereignty. They waited until the French president and prime minister were on a ship returning from a state visit to Russia, ensuring that the Entente powers couldn't coordinate a response. When the ultimatum was finally delivered to Belgrade on July 23rd, the world finally woke up to the danger. The document contained 10 points, including a demand that Austrian officials be allowed to enter Serbia to lead the judicial investigation, a direct violation of the Serbian constitution. The British Foreign Secretary, Sir Edward Grey, described it as the most formidable document that was ever addressed from one state to another. Serbia actually said yes to almost everything. So why wasn't war averted? In a stunning display of diplomatic flexibility, the Serbian government accepted 8 of the 10 points. They were willing to swallow almost every humiliation to avoid a conflict they knew they couldn't win. But they could not agree to let Austrian police operate on their soil. It was the one no the Austrians were looking for. When the Serbian response reached Vienna, the Austrian officials didn't even read it with a mind toward peace. They saw the no on point number 6 and immediately severed diplomatic relations. On the 28th of July 1914, exactly 1 month after the shots in Sarajevo, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. As the first Austrian shells began to scream across the Danube and explode in the streets of Belgrade, the mechanical gears of the alliance system began to turn. The tripwires were now active. Russia ordered a partial mobilization to protect Serbia. Germany, seeing Russia move, felt the walls closing in. The diplomats had spent a month playing a game of chicken, and now they were discovering that the steering wheels had come off in their hands. The world was no longer being led by statesmen. It was being led by military timetables. By the final days of July 1914, the Gilded Cage of Europe had transformed into a high-speed engine with no brakes. Diplomacy, which had once been a conversation of nuance and slow-moving letters, was now a race against the mechanical clock. In the early 20th century, war was not a switch you could flip. It was a massive industrial process that required the movement of millions of men, millions of horses, and billions of tons of supplies across a continent. This was the era of the iron timidable. Once the mobilization orders were signed and the first trains began to puff out of their stations, the laws of logistics replaced the laws of politics. Every track, every switch, and every coal tender was now a cog in a clockwork apocalypse that could not be rewound. The world had built a machine so large and so efficient that the men who owned it no longer knew how to turn it off. The microscopic detail that made the outbreak of war inevitable was the rigid, unforgiving geometry of the Schlieffen Plan. Germany was the industrial heart of Europe, but geographically, It was trapped in a nightmare. To the west lay France, fortified and vengeful. To the east lay the vastness of Russia, the Slavic steamroller. The German general staff, led by the brooding and brilliant Helmuth von Moltke, knew they could not win a war on two fronts simultaneously. Their solution was a desperate, split-second gamble that turned a diplomatic crisis into a mathematical race for survival. The plan assumed that Russia, with its primitive railway network and vast distances, would take exactly 6 weeks, 42 days, to fully mobilize its massive army. In those 42 days, Germany would hurl 90% of its entire military force through the neutral gateway of Belgium, encircle Paris in a giant right hook, and knock France out of the war. Then, they would rush their victorious troops back across the continent to meet the Russians just as they reached the German border. It was a plan that relied on perfection. There was no room for delay, no room for snow, and certainly no room for second thoughts. The most terrifying aspect of the Schlieffen Plan was that it had no Plan B. It was a one-way trigger that forced Germany to attack France even if the original conflict was only with Russia. There was no diplomatic middle ground. If Russia mobilized even a single army corps to protect Serbia, Germany's military logic dictated that they must attack France immediately. To wait and see if the Tsar was bluffing would mean losing the 42-day window and being crushed between two giants. This was the tyranny of the railway. When Kaiser Wilhelm II, suddenly gripped by a moment of sanity on August 1st, asked Moltke if the army could simply stay in the east and ignore France, the general reportedly broke down in tears. He explained that the entire deployment, the millions of men, the thousands of horses, the tons of ammunition, was already programmed into the train schedules. To stop the trains would be to turn the German army into a useless, unsupplied mob. The machines were now making the decisions for the men, and the rails were leading straight into the abyss. The microscopic reality of this industrial war was visible in every train station from Berlin to St. Petersburg. Thousands of young men, many of whom had never left their villages, were issued thick wool uniforms that smelled of mothballs and heavy Mauser rifles. They were packed into cattle cars scrawled with chalk messages like, "To Paris" or "To Berlin." The scale of the movement was staggering. In Germany alone, a train crossed the Rhine Bridge at Cologne every 10 minutes for 2 consecutive weeks. Every horse in the country was requisitioned, every factory prepared to churn out brass shells, and every mother feared the sudden appearance of the telegram messenger. This was the first time in history that a war was being fought not just by soldiers, but by the entire mechanical infrastructure of a civilization. But one final, legalistic tripwire remained: the scrap of paper. To execute the Schlieffen Plan, German boots had to march through neutral Belgium. This was not a military necessity for Belgium, but it was a diplomatic death sentence for Germany. Since 1839, Belgium's neutrality had been guaranteed by a treaty signed by all the great powers, including Prussia. The German Chancellor, Bethmann Hollweg, dismissed the treaty as a mere scrap of paper compared to the life or death necessity of the German Empire. But to Great Britain, Belgium was a sacred red line. The British could not allow a hostile superpower to control the ports of the English Channel, the gateway to their island home. Britain was the only power that didn't have to go to war by a direct alliance trigger. Yet they chose to enter the slaughter over a matter of national honor and strategic survival. On the morning of the 4th of August, 1914, German troops crossed the Belgian border at Gemmenich. The Belgians, led by their soldier King Albert, did not simply step aside. They fought with a suicidal ferocity that stunned the German generals, slowing the Iron Timidable by several crucial, agonizing days. This violation of neutrality gave the British government the moral and political cover it needed. As the 11 p.m. deadline passed in London, the British Empire, ruling a quarter of the globe, was at war. Sir Edward Grey, the the British Foreign Secretary, stood at his window in the Foreign Office and watched the lamplighters in the park below. He turned to a friend and uttered the most famous prophecy of the age. "The lamps are going out all over Europe. We shall not see them lit again in our lifetime." The world of Franz Ferdinand and Sophie was gone, replaced by the roar of the machine gun and the silence of the mass grave. Gavrilo Princip did not die a hero's death on a smoke-filled battlefield or in a moment of triumphant glory. He died on the 28th of April 1918, in a dark, damp stone cell in the fortress of Terezin, in what is now the Czech Republic. By the time the end came, he was a skeletal figure, a mere shadow of the 19-year-old student who had stood outside Schiller's deli. Tuberculosis, the same white plague that had fueled his fatalism, had slowly consumed his body from the inside out. His left arm had been amputated because the disease had rotted the bone, and he weighed barely 90 pounds. He was a prisoner of the very apocalypse he had unleashed, forced to spend his final years listening to the distant, rhythmic thunder of the world tearing itself apart. Terezin was a vital transit hub for the Austro-Hungarian military machine. From his narrow cell, Princip could hear the constant, metallic clatter of troop trains heading to the Eastern Front and the muffled, low-frequency roar of heavy artillery tests in the surrounding hills. He reportedly spent his hours in total silence, staring at the gray stone walls, yet his presence was felt by his captors. On the wall of his cell, he had scratched a final, haunting poem in Cyrillic. "Our ghosts will walk through Vienna, wander through the court, frightening the lords." He died just months before the empire he hated vanished from the map of the world forever, proving that a single bullet could indeed be more powerful than 1,000 years of lineage. The Great War did more than kill 16 million people. It acted as a giant, industrial meat grinder that pulverized the very concept of the old world. By the time the armistice was signed in November 1918, four of the most powerful dynasties in human history, the Habsburgs of Austria, the Hohenzollerns of Germany, the Romanovs of Russia, and the Ottomans of Turkey, had been swept into the dustbin of history. The Gilded Cage of the 19th century had been melted down in the fires of the trenches. In its place was a new world defined by fractured borders, broken economies, and a deep, cynical trauma that would haunt the collective psyche of humanity for a century. The tragic irony of the Sarajevo assassination is that Princip's dream of a Yugoslavia, a unified land of southern Slavs, was technically realized in 1918, but it was a nation born from the ashes of a war that had killed 1/6 of the entire Serbian population. The ethnic tensions that Franz Ferdinand had hoped to solve through his trialism plan did not disappear. They were simply bottled up under new flags and new dictators. Decades later, in the 1992, those same ancient grievances would explode once again in the very streets where Princip had stood. As the siege of Sarajevo became the longest and bloodiest in modern history, the ghosts Princip wrote about were still haunting the cobblestones, a reminder that blood spilled in the name of nationalism rarely stays in the past. If we look through the microscopic lens of history, we see that the assassination was not just the start of World War I. It was the point alpha for almost every major tragedy of the 20th century. Without the chaos of the war's end, there is no Russian Revolution, and therefore no Soviet Union. Without the humiliating peace treaties forced upon Germany, there is no rise of Adolf Hitler, no Holocaust, and no Second World War. The very borders of the modern Middle East were drawn in the wake of the Ottoman collapse triggered by that summer in 1914. We are all, in a sense, living in the debris of the Grafenstift that stalled on a street corner because of a driver's wrong turn. Today, the corner of Franz Joseph Street is marked by a simple plaque. For years, the footprints of Gavrilo Princip were embedded in the sidewalk in concrete, a shrine to a man seen by some as a liberator and by others as the ultimate terrorist. But the most poignant reminder of the tragedy lies far from the city. Franz Ferdinand and Sophie are not buried in the grand imperial crypt in Vienna alongside the other Habsburg emperors. Because of their morganatic marriage, they were laid to rest in a private crypt at Artstetten Castle. They lie together in white marble sarcophagi, finally granted the dignity in death that the Viennese court denied them in life. They are buried together as they lived outcasts from the system they were destined to lead, and the first victims of a war they tried to prevent. History is often taught as a series of grand, inevitable forces, but the story of Sarajevo is a chilling reminder of the power of the individual. A husband's love, a driver's mistake, a mechanical failure, and a teenager's anger were enough to bring down 1,000 years of civilization. As we look at the world today, with its new alliances and rising tensions, we must ask ourselves, what invisible tripwires are we walking over right now? History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. And the echoes of those two shots in Sarajevo are still ringing if you listen closely enough.